She was a witness to one of the biggest financial disasters in recent memory. But when Alayne Flesichmann spoke up to her Wall Street bosses, she was ignored. That turned the Canadian-born lawyer into a whistleblower. And as Paul Johnson reports, her testimony led to one of the largest settlements in U.S. history.
The year was 2008. The U.S. economy was crashing. It was all over the news.
Clearly, the housing and credit crisis is having a seismic impact here on Wall Street.
A massive mess in the country's banking industry.
Right now, we're in tough times, no question about it.
Banks were going broke, stocks were plummeting, and the housing market bubble had burst.
The Dow Jones in New York suffered its biggest one-day drop so far this year.
It was called the subprime mortgage crisis.
The most current financial crisis in the United States is estimated to cost $21 trillion. Caused the Great Recession, lost over 10 million Americans their jobs.
But this is not a story about the financial crisis. It's a story about a whistleblower who tried to stop it.
At some stage, you just have to say, I don't want to be a part of this.
Her name is Alayne Flesichmann, and she is Canadian.
I think it's one thing when you're watching things from afar and on the news and thinking, oh, gee, that's terrible, that's illegal, whatever. But when you're in the middle of it, and if you don't talk, you're actually a part of the cover-up, it's a much harder position to be in.
Alayne did try to speak up, but nobody listened. It was 2006, and Alayne was working for J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, an American bank, one of the largest banks in the world. Alayne's job was to review home loans that J.P. Morgan wanted to purchase from mortgage lenders, review them to make sure there were no red flags. Just a couple of months into her job, the first red flag she saw didn't come from the loans. It came from the boss.
They hired a new diligence supervisor, and the first thing that he did was come out with this no email policy. He wouldn't send emails, and we weren't allowed to send emails to him. So the fact that he didn't want people to know what we were doing was immediately a very worrisome sign.
Oh, it's beyond a red flag. This is infrared. Infra means beyond red. This is go to jail, put out your wrists, and we'll handcuff you type stuff.
That's William Black. He used to work for the U.S. federal government as a financial regulator, responsible for investigating financial crime. He says the fact that managers at J.P. Morgan didn't want to keep a record of their actions is a clear sign they had something to hide.
This is the kind of thing as a prosecutor you salivate about, right? The most difficult thing in a prosecution like this is to show intent. Did the people know they were buying bad loans? Well, that's pretty easy in this context.
Let's stop here for a second. This is what was going on. J.P. Morgan and other banks were buying home loans, bundling them together to create what is called a mortgage-backed security. Then they would sell the security to investors. Investors were told by the banks the securities were high quality, but it wasn't true. A number of those mortgages were going to fail. That's because they were given to people who couldn't afford to make the payments. Alayne knew this. She had seen it during her review.
One loan I'll always remember was a manicurist who had a reported income of $117,000 per year. And even today, if you're a manicurist in New York, the median wage is $23,000 per year. It just wasn't a possible income.
Alayne couldn't believe what she was seeing. Turns out she wasn't alone. Some of her colleagues were finding bad loans too. In fact, they even tried to speak out about it. But Alayne says management shut them down immediately.
Our diligence people tried to say no to buying it and kept refusing to clear it, to sell it to investors. Senior people just started coming down and yelling at them and insulting them and just not letting them say no.
When Alayne brought her concerns to her bosses, crickets. Nothing happened. So Alayne sent a memo above their heads to the top bosses. Crickets again.
I just couldn't believe that they were doing it. I mean, we know as professionals in this industry that if you put these loans into a security, the security is going to have catastrophically bad results, and that's exactly what happened.
Alayne's memo did send shockwaves, but not in a way she expected. Just over a year later, she was laid off along with others.
When you look at the timing of this, I wrote the memo and then I was dismissed. I think anyone who's seen that memo knows that when you clearly set out something that names certain executives that are involved in a fraud, you're not going to keep your job.
Out of work, Alayne moved back to Canada, but she always wondered what happened with the loans. Well, in 2012, Alayne finally found out when an assistant U.S. attorney from the Department of Justice called to chat.
That was the first time actually that I found out that the loans had been securitized in large amounts. They had all the emails and the reports and the notifications and my memo.
The prosecutor wanted Alayne to testify, and she did. Again, putting her career on the line in the hopes of setting things right.
You're stealing out of people's retirement funds. I mean, it's almost quintessentially the stealing money from an old lady walking down the street.
But the bank didn't end up going to court or facing criminal charges.
Today, the Departments of Justice have reached a landmark $25 billion agreement with the nation's 5 largest mortgage servicers, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase and Company.
Instead, the U.S. Department of Justice cut a deal with J.P. Morgan for $13 billion. It sounds like a huge penalty, but Black says when you look at the fine print, it's not.
The Justice Department wants to make the settlement sound larger. It's just, A, none of it comes from the individuals, so you don't get deterrence. B, none of it is significant in terms of actually going to change the behavior. So no, these settlements, by definition, cannot be serious.
And here's why. About $7 billion of the $13 billion is tax deductible. Another $4 billion is for consumer relief. It's not an actual payment, it's credit the bank gets for doing things it can still make money on, like lowering mortgage rates for struggling homeowners. The remaining $2 billion is a penalty for misleading investors.
It is simple to get top CEOs to agree to huge fines in an organization. Because here's what the CEO cares about. Number 1, I don't go to prison. Number 2, I don't lose my job. Number 3, I don't have to pay back my bonuses.
16 by 9 reached out to Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase and Company, to talk about the settlement agreement and Alayne's allegations. We were told he wasn't available to do an interview. But J.P. Morgan did admit that it failed to disclose to investors that some of these investments did not meet their own policies. It's been an 8-year ordeal for Alayne, and there is no sign of it stopping. Today, she spends much of her time meeting with lawyers who are trying to get money back for investors. It hasn't been easy for Alayne to come forward with what she witnessed, but she is relieved to have it off her conscience.
It feels a lot better than it did. You know, you hear people talk about their conscience and that they couldn't do things because of their conscience. And I literally, physically was just so ill that I had to come forward.
And that is our broadcast for tonight. A reminder, you can always connect with us on Facebook and Twitter or at global16by9.com. Until next week, I'm Carolyn Jarvis. From all of us here at 16 by 9, thanks for watching. She was a witness to one of the biggest financial disasters in recent memory. But when Alayne Flesichmann spoke up to her Wall Street bosses, she was ignored. That turned
banking industry.
Right now, we're in tough times. No question about it.
Banks were going broke, stocks were plummeting, and the housing market bubble had burst.
The Dow Jones in New York suffered its biggest one-day drop so far this year.
It was called the subprime mortgage crisis.
The most current financial crisis in the United States is estimated to cost $21.
Turned the Canadian-born lawyer into a whistleblower. And as Paul Johnson reports, her testimony led to one of the largest settlements in U.S. history.
The year was 2008. The U.S. economy was crashing. It was all over the news.
Clearly, the housing and credit crisis is having a seismic impact here on Wall Street.
A massive mess in the country's